And to add another dimension to the discussion, Professor Gibril Faal will talk about the Africans in the diaspora and their continental connections. So please could I ask Professor Faal to make his presentation. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Adote, and thank you for convening this very important conference. My observations would focus on diaspora organizations, African organizations in the UK, and in the context of cooperatives, mutuals, and socio-economic development in Africa. I would make 5 observations relating to the strength of this story, and 5 observations relating to what I think are challenges and weaknesses with view to having an understanding of how to improve the present situation. The first observation is this. Almost all diaspora and diaspora organizations have this concept, either stated or unstated. It is always implied that the better we do in the diaspora, the greater our ability to contribute to socio-economic and cultural development in the country or continent of origin. This was true in 1786 when perhaps the first diaspora organization in the UK was set up by Ekeano, the Sons of Africa. It is true, and it was true with Marcus Garvey and UNIA and that movement. And it is true today with diaspora who come to the UK. And it's even true for those who've left Africa because they were suffering exclusion or some other form of repression. Even for those categories interested in improving themselves, not to abandon the continent, but to contribute one way or another. Second observation is that that is so fundamentally true and in line with the history of torture that Africans have suffered, that solidarity, the principles and practices of pooling resources together, of aggregation and of mutualization are often present, again, either formalized or informal. That makes diaspora and African diaspora organizations predisposed to organizational and corporate structures like cooperatives, at least on the face of it as a starting point, because the principles, the 7 principles of cooperatives, as Professor Gordon and Esther Gicheru presented earlier, you would see that the Africans actually agreed with this. They had their own versions of these principles beforehand. So that, in my observation, has actually not disappeared in the contemporary situation. Those principles are still present. The third element is that of innovation, due to, of course, the extraordinary restrictions and strains that are forced upon Africans and African communities. Almost by necessity, they have to be innovative to find their way around. And the fourth is on formality. When and how do you move from those principles and the use of innovation and social networks to create legal structures within which to operate? These, to my mind, are so strong that they represent themselves in ways that sometimes we don't see on the face of it. Take, for example, the 1958 race riots in London. If you examine the documents, you hear a lot about prejudice based on white supremacy with the Teddy Boys, and a whole lot of or the racial hatred based on pure racial prejudice. But you find in that evidence a lot of what can refer to as economic jealousy. Because what was the situation in West London? African migrants, predominantly from the Caribbean, are excluded from many things, but let me focus on housing. As those of us who live in the UK, we all know the story that up until the late 50s or 60s, it was legal and very common for landlords to post notes on their doors saying no dogs, no Irish, no blacks. So faced with that exclusion, the Caribbean diaspora in London used traditional African cooperative methods that were carried from Africa to the Caribbean to deal with this situation they were facing. So if landlords will not rent them, why shouldn't they themselves buy the houses and be the landlords? At the time, the challenge was you need a deposit. But effectively, if you have a deposit, you can raise a mortgage from a mutual organization, that is the building societies. So they use their SUSU, their partner system, to put together monies every week, every month, and there would be enough to give that pool to one person to pay for their deposit. And in the next period, another person put their deposit, and those who buy the property would then sublet amongst their community. So within a short time, you then find in West London, Jamaicans, Barbadians, and others owning the property. And the white working class poor, amongst other things, they develop new resentments because they've been in those communities for centuries, perhaps, and never owned their property. So that sort of summarizes, in a sense, the strength of diaspora and diaspora organizations, how they, out of necessity, bring traditions of economic activity to their advantage. But I pause there because then that's you can say that's a story of success. Why then haven't we seen the building up on that success, the replication, and the expansion of that success? And that brings me to what I observe as weaknesses and challenges within the way African diaspora organizations organize themselves in relation to wealth creation and wealth retention. The first observation would be around what I call starting and growing. There is a very high propensity, likelihood, up to today, for African Black communities in the UK are more likely to create a social enterprise than any other grouping. So there is that very high propensity, but it is not equated with either a higher number of big success stories or a higher number of continuous existence, production, and growth. Today, if you want to identify a diaspora, African diaspora organization, either from continental Africa or from the Caribbean, the oldest you would get to, you would struggle, but the oldest you would get to would be perhaps the late 1960s, of one with a legal structure of continuous existence. And that is far from being a fair representation of diaspora organizations in the UK, because the first legal one, as I said, could have been as early as 1787. So there is something around harvesting from that high propensity of germination to be able to harvest and save the seeds from us and to grow. I hope that the next sessions, the second and third, which go more into the practice, would pick up on some of these practical issues. But one area of weakness or concern is on the gap between startups and survivals and growth. And that might be strongly linked to the next point, which is the one around the degree of formalization. The greater part of the activities that happen, in my sense, happen within an informal sector. And I am not necessarily opposed to informality. In fact, in many senses, I promote and support informality, but within the context of a plural ecology, whereby you also have a balance of formal organizations. And we are relatively weak in creating the formal structures that grow. And this point can be even linked to a point that Kehinde have just mentioned relating to the success or lack of that we have in supporting our countries of origin. As organizations, our net contribution to support African countries is relatively small at that formal level compared to our extraordinary success at the informal level, whereby individuals and smaller family groups support families back home. So there are more individual African diaspora and migrants who have lifted people out of poverty far more than any UN agency that you can think of. And often they do it within a generation. They do it within a period of 15 to 20 years of them being migrants. But that in a way is in the formal sector, that informal sector that we could have kept. But we need to find means of replicating that sort of success within the formal setups. Another way to illustrate it is if you take remittances, monies that the diaspora is sending back to Africa, and in the last set of numbers, it's about 86 billion that goes to Africa from the African diaspora. Over 95%, maybe as high as 98% of that is individual remittances supporting families and friends and that direct network, rather than collective remittances which support communities. So there is something to be learned and some improvements to be made there. The third observation linked to the second, which is around formal organizations, is the size of organizations. So you are likely to see more small and micro organizations, be them formal, be them credit unions, be them cooperatives or companies limited by guarantee, as compared to medium-sized or large ones. Again, I'm not arguing that large ones are better, but I argue that a healthy ecology requires a good balance of small, medium, and large, whereas the ecology in the UK is predominated by micro organizations, which I argue is unhealthy. The fourth one is about what I call regenerative legacy. That regenerative legacy, I would be interested to hear from Professor Gordon, for example, to tell us how old is the oldest continuously operating cooperative, African-American cooperative in the United States. It is perhaps likely that there would be one or two examples of that continuity of growth based on predominantly the use of legal corporate structures. If you do not use those legal corporate structures, the likelihood of a regeneration and continuity are likely to be very, very low. And therefore, what we see is a series of growths, peaks and decreases and deaths. And that, again, is not a healthy pattern. We need to have a great number that continue to operate and to grow, to create a legacy that is both sustainable and regenerative in all the resources that we have. And the final observation observation, or second to last final observation, is that for the UK in particular, almost all of the activities relating to corporate structures we use, including cooperatives, are almost totally dependent on what's happening within the wider context. In this case, cooperatives in the UK. And cooperatives in the UK, unlike the story of post-colonial Kenya, where we have seen growth, and perhaps Kenya is perhaps the best case study of cooperatives in Africa. In the UK, that has not been the experience. Since the 1950s, the cooperatives have suffered a decline. And in the late 1990s, early 2000s, it was nearly a fatal decline, to the extent that one of the biggest cooperatives, which is the Cooperative Wholesale Society, the one that owned the supermarkets, was actually received a hostile attack from Andrew Reagan, who wanted to take it over. Because at that time, we were still in the afterglow of Thatcherite right-wing privatization, and many of the mutuals had been demutualized, including the building societies. I think now only a handful exist. So with that national framework of decline, you find that the African organizations were suffering from that decline. They do not, or they did not have the independence of sticking to the principles and their practices outside of the bigger influence. And of course, the cooperative movement in the UK, apart from that threat, you also found that the early innovations that we saw in the sector didn't happen. It's the cooperative who invented what we now call loyalty schemes. It's the loyalty schemes that in the UK, it used to be called the divvy or the dividend. If you are a member, that means you collect points and have extra benefits. But more importantly, data about your buying behavior was being gathered for commercial intelligence. You can see how then that was picked up by the multinationals and have now been taken up by the internet giants. So from a period of that degree of innovation to a situation where the cooperative movement in the UK is so moribund that a capitalist felt that they have a chance to come and take it over. That was the story. And internally, as recent as 20, sometimes the cooperative movement inflicted the damage by itself. As recent as 2010, the cooperative bank and the cooperative group, which was the welfares, had a chairman who was a Methodist minister who was filmed involved in drug taking and drug dealing. Paul Flowers, a huge scandal that nearly killed off the organization. So within that domain and within that scenario, the African social enterprises and cooperatives are just flailing within that situation without the power to insist and stick to what they want to do outside of the mainstream. And final observation that I would want to make, especially about wanting to achieve one, continuity, second, legacy, a regenerative legacy. My sense is the new innovation in this sector should be beyond the African diaspora servicing the African diaspora. It should be about the African diaspora using everything it has, innovation, creativity, everything, to service everyone. And the best way to illustrate that is, I'll make a link to so-called cultural appropriation. So even within this period of Black Lives Matters, when we saw Congress people in the United States taking the knee with the kente wrapped around their necks, some liked that and some didn't like that. To me, my observation was, I am pleased that the whole world uses kente, because that is a gift from Ghana to the whole world, not just to Ghanaians. but I am more interested as to who
makes
owns the companies that produce them. I would be more than happy if no African wears it, but everybody else who wears it is paying us. So that, I think, needs to be an important part of the discussion of what next. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed, Gibril. Thank you. That's very, very helpful.